So this is a good session to have at the end of the day because everybody's been learning all throughout the whole conference as we all try to find things to actually take away, whether you've been in the sector for a long time or you're new. And in fact, that's some of what this session is about, is thinking about how do we share that knowledge of people that have either been around for a long time, and frankly, it's often the knowledge of new people also about the people that have been in for a long time forget what things are hard and what things are easy. So as this field grows, that's a little what this session is about. The center of this session is all about impact for public good. And I think of impact quite simply as just making a change in some way. And it's in a deliberately broad umbrella because there are so many different ways to make impact. And I think that this is a project that tries to look across different sectors and especially look systematically at how all of our projects can have more impact. So there was a report that came out a year ago that is around impact. It's a free download you can get online. And just if some of the ideas we're going to be talking about build on some of this. And maybe just, this is actually a story that began 2 years ago. Aussie was there. Maybe you want to...
Yeah, and Ben was there, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So it was really Ben's initiative. It was the 10th anniversary, 2013, I think. And we were all celebrating 10 years for Games for Change, and Ben was also one of the co-founders. And, you know, in one of the breaks, he's running towards me and he's like, Asi, we need to do something now. After 10 years, we need to do this typology. And it took us some time to figure it out. But, you know, after a few months, I came back to you. We had a funder to let us start. And the basic idea was, you know, after 10 years that we talk about Games for Change in a very general way and putting everything in one bucket, can we start being a bit more sophisticated and nuanced and look at different types and start to classify for us, for people, maybe discuss it with other people and start to understand where it's going and how we can define it.
Yeah, so shout out to the Packard Foundation for funding some of this, and to Aussie, because this was an idea we just talked about, and he makes things happen like sometimes. Oh, well, actually, we have funding. We actually have to go write this thing. So it was great. We've done a bunch of interviews over the past few years with different designers, with funders, with different folks asking, what are the barriers to impact? And how do we start overcoming some of those barriers? And each of us has a different perspective on where that comes from. So I was at Games for Change. I worked at the MacArthur Foundation, so I've seen a little of the funder side of things. And now I'm an academic. And maybe, Colleen, maybe we should just also introduce ourselves.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Colleen. I teach here at Parsons at the New School. And I guess my perspective on this, we've talked a lot about this work and the study and had plenty of formal and informal conversations about it. And my perspective is really about how do you, and I run a research lab here where we do work with external partners like the Red Cross and Boys and Girls Clubs and others. And the big question is, how do you actually start a project with the understanding of what kind of impact you want to see, right? So how do you actually design around those goals and stay on track? Because games are complicated things. They can sometimes, you know, depending on what you're making, take a really long time to make, and you can easily get lost. So I think that's really been something that we've talked a lot about.
And I think that in some ways, schools of design are great places to make some of this knowledge deeper, because it's not just about each designer improving their own practice. All of us should be looking to learn from our mistakes and our successes, but also how does one project share with another? Colleen did a great session on failure yesterday, thinking a little bit about sharing failure. And a lot of us, how many people here have read a post-mortem? Printed post-mortem in some form. Show of hands high. So I'm just kind of curious about that. That's about half. And I've talked with a bunch of designers who have said, oh yeah, I do occasionally read post-mortems. And I ask how about journal articles, and the hands are like go down. So it's the question of like, how do we actually transfer knowledge? And the most consistent answer is that within an organization, prior examples get discussed a lot. So if we tried to launch a product and it didn't work, there's a really strong internal sense of what did and didn't work on our prior products. And that may work for an organization that builds a lot of the same kind of thing, but especially for new organizations, of which there are a lot. There are a lot of people coming into this space who don't have that experience. can we as a sector offer more? So a couple thinking tools are what we've been trying to develop, as well as principles. And part of this happens with some of our advisory board. We have folks from Constance Steilenkühler, who has been working with Hevga and worked in the White House, Tracy Fullerton. I can go through, actually, these are just a few of our advisors. We have a lot of advisors, and I think maybe in the interest of time, I'm just gonna accelerate through. A lot of the, metaphorically, one way to think about this is that often when we think about impact, we think about it as if it is a big, broad umbrella, a broad door, but in practice, often a lot of people I talk to sometimes feel like they have trouble fitting through that door. And that's partly because the actual ways we measure impact may be constrained implicitly. We may not even realize the ways we are making assumptions about what is impact is legitimate, and what are the tools to measure impact. So education, for example, is a track at this conference. Education talks a lot about impact, and I think that that is fantastic. But education has one set of tools where there are actually many more. And we're going to hint at some of those other ways, which a lot of folks may not even be aware of. So, for example, when we talk about impact, if I were to ask you to start, if we were to do a brainstorm right now on different kinds of impact, I bet we could start making a circle like this around the edges, start listing different kinds of impact. It would start looking like this, and then very quickly it would have twice as many as that, and I think we would soon have an overwhelming number. In fact, if you even take education and you start digging in a little bit and asking, well, how do we actually understand the space here? This is a conceptual map of education, and you can look at the inner layer. It's part design, philosophy, education in terms of organizations, psychology. You can look at the different domains. You can look at everyone from Dewey to Piaget, Vygotsky, Brunner. So you can look at the classic people that are in that space. You can start looking at different theories, learning styles, homeschooling, critical pedagogy, experiential education, radical constructivism, social constructivism. You know, these lists go on, and I want to just underscore that this is just education. You can do the same thing for a number of different domains. So if you want to go deep, you can go deep, but how much time do we all have to go this deep on any of our projects? You want to start a design project, we have a budget, we actually want to build things, we want to get things done.
Yeah, Ben, you're scaring me here.
Oh, my.
Yeah, look at all that stuff, and you know, I mean, I wonder, does everyone kind of understand what we mean when we say impact? No, I see some heads shaking now. So yeah, let's. What is that? What is impact?
Well, I'll toss it around. Maybe this is a good question for Aussie, I think, because when you were leading Games for Change, I bet this is a question that came up a lot for you.
Yeah, and do we have that slide somewhere in next, or you want to do it as a teaser?
We can do this one more.
Yeah, I want you to show that one that
Okay.
comes after that. So one of the things that happened in Games for Change, I'm sure that many of you, whether it's your first festival or you've been to a few others before, there's something very unique about this community, but it also makes it super challenging. That there are very different types of people coming to this community and coming to make games. You have funders, and you have public funders, foundations, and NGOs, and then you have corporations that fund games. You know, we had one project with American Express. You have big NGOs and you have small NGOs that work very differently. Then you have game designers and game creators that are coming from this place. I know a lot of creative people that are showing up at Games for Change and they're not game designers, but they want to get into the space. So all this kind of very unique combination is fascinating, and I think it makes it a very unique space that has a lot of collaboration, but it also brings a lot of different voices. And my experience when I'm speaking to others outside the space and when I'm using slides like this is that there's a lot of education to do of what games are even able to achieve. And through the conversation with Ben and through that report that you saw, we started to try to put this typology, and this is obviously one version of it. And it's probably missing a lot of categories that a lot of people here would love to hear from you guys. What do you think is missing and how do you want to approach it differently? But it helped a lot of people that I talked to start thinking about games and Games for Change in a more in a more educated and and kind of also see the difference between intention and how to measure success in each one of those categories.
Hang on, you guys didn't define impact. So I'm going to paraphrase. We were talking about this earlier, and Ben, you had a really great way of describing it. And then I want to talk about this slide because and Asi, maybe you can walk us through it. But I think Ben, you said something like impact is the change you want to see your game make. I would say in your game because it would sound better, but the change you want to see your game make, right? So impact is just that. It's like you want 12-year-olds to learn algebra, right? Or you want to get a group of people in this community to begin to talk to each other about what's important to them on, in this particular town, right? Would that be impact? Right, and part of it's measuring that because a lot of Games for Change do have funders, and funders want to know, did you actually make the change?
And some of it is individual, some of it is changing a community, right?
Yeah. So you've got some of it up here.
So this list is an attempt, let me go back one slide just to show you, is an attempt to say, can we cluster some of these different categories? We have so many different kinds of impact. It would be so useful if we could say there are a couple kinds or types of impact. So we've been playing with different versions of this for a while, and this is a little of our proposal.
Yeah, I want to say something very important about this way of looking at things that I think makes kind of this typology more interesting and maybe taking the conversation forward. Until now, when I was working in this space as a game developer with you guys, it was all about the content. So even the tracks in this conference now are divided by content, health, education, etc. And what we try to do here is divide it by types of impact. So again, focusing on what the game is trying to achieve, or the games are trying to achieve, and look at case studies that specifically do that, and then you start to see that not only that your goals are changing, it's also the people that you're going to work with to prove that you're actually effective are going to be very different experts in each one of those types of impact.
Yeah.
For example, yeah.
So for example, on the left, we have learning, and because we're at Games for Change and thinking a little about civics, we called it civic learning. But for those of you that want to think about it more broadly, just think about learning, cognition, facts, knowledge, skills, things that we often measure as a property of an individual in their brain. So for instance, we rarely measure teams in the same way. We measure individuals, and that's how schools also work. You don't graduate as a team, we graduate individuals. There's lots of kind of assumptions baked into that about what do we measure and how do things work. But that's only one way we can look at games. Here are a few of the other ways. Raising awareness. So this is a classic strategy for a communication campaign, something like whether it's seat belts or telling everyone that we have a new healthcare system nationwide. It's not necessarily about whether you have a new skill in your brain, and it isn't really about whether you've got the fact of healthcare, although there are education things too, because these all intersect and relate. But a lot of what you might evaluate a campaign for communication about is, did we reach a lot of people? That's about the number of people you reach, and a lot of what matters is things like, how did it spread? How did it connect to existing media sources? What was the media ecosystem it worked in? So these are things that schools of communication deal with a lot, and there are ways that we measure that and evaluate that are not about education. They're not about measuring just whether somebody, one individual knows something or doesn't, although again, it relates. So next, on the stronger community side, just to give another contrast to show how different things can be, a game like Makin' Money, which the Knight Foundation funded in Macon, Georgia, was in some ways an effort to make that place stronger, was to deepen the sense of local identity. And this was a game that people played with currency, paper currency. It was an alternative currency. And when you, in order to trade it in for local goods, so as part of playing the game, you might be able to do something like buy shoes or get an ice cream or some wings at a local restaurant. You could only do it if you could find somebody with a matching piece of paper currency. And what do you know? They distributed it across lines of socioeconomic segregation. So people that tended to live in one zip code that didn't often talk with another zip code had to meet each other and interact a little bit in order to cash it in. So this has overtones of all sorts of different social programs, things like economic incentives, things like business development. And how do you evaluate something like business development? How do you evaluate a tax break? In some ways, I would say, what do you compare this to? I might compare it to a tax break, right? So I'm not going to compare an educational game to a tax break, but a game like this you might understand as how similar is this to something that a local government might pass and implement, a cultural strategy, a tax strategy. So that's just the third. Do we want to mention any more that might give people a sense of some of this?
Yeah, I want to give one example. So I think 2 months ago, I wrote you an email. You know, before that, we had 5 categories on the slide. And this was based on the neurogaming, kind of a very new field. And here is the first time we're doing the track.
I wanted to have like a neuroscience bingo at the conference this year. I felt like you could really like, you know, there's a lot of that.
Right.
Here comes the neuroscience.
And then you have people that claim that, you know, they can make a game that will affect the individual almost like a pill or equal as a pill that the doctor prescribes, right? And I talked to Ben and I said, look, it doesn't fit much, you know, it's very different than the other categories that, you know, there is a change, it takes time to, you know, take effect. And here we're talking about something that sometimes happens in real time, you know, pain reduction, like Snow World shows. And we invented a new category for that.
And what's great about this is that you can differentiate it from the education outcomes because similar to something like mindfulness or meditation, people can actually feel less pain by adjusting their breathing and thinking and meditating. And that's really different than whether they know something. It's in some ways about brain state, which is an interesting goal for a game to try and achieve a certain brain state.
So in this case, you would choose a different way to measure it, right? And it, you know, with learning, perhaps you've got, well, the game itself could be the test, right? We've heard that games are the ultimate assessment tools. But then with neurotraining, maybe you're looking a little bit more at galvanic response or something physiological even.
And it would be almost unthinkable that you won't do it with a brain scientist.
Right.
You know?
Well, fMRIs, people have heard of these, right? These heat maps we've seen of the brain, right? These are pretty terrible ways if you want to know whether somebody has learned how to add. I think these are very blunt tools, and you wouldn't want to use brain scans for something like whether somebody knows a fact. So in that sense, that's another way of underscoring how different the ways of measuring this are. But if you want to know something like whether somebody can relax themselves and calm down in an intense situation, then you might look at something like neuroscience.
Right, and someone probably from the audience, or many of you think, yeah, but you know, it doesn't work like this. I mean, my game touches on 3 categories, right? So I think we're talking about prioritization. We are obviously aware that there are games that are doing more than one, taking more than one discipline, but it's really about what you're trying to succeed in most, what you're trying to achieve most, and what will define, you know, if you achieved what your goal was.
One of the curious things that we saw is we looked at the academic literature, because a lot of these things have studies attached to them, and every single cross-the-field literature survey that we could find left out entire categories, which says something more about how disciplines work. So neuroscience as a category isn't treated that seriously as something that community building, people who do community revitalization are not interested in brain scans, right? They're in such different spaces that they don't write about each other. They don't talk about each other. But I would argue that some of the games in this space, in this room, could still learn from each other. So I think that we were first and foremost interested in being inclusive, in trying to understand the variety of impact that is possible with games. So we wanted to try and list as many categories first as possible, and then at the second to try and be simplifying, to try and not have it be an overwhelming category. So there's a balancing act between those two things to try and have the category system be useful. In this way, in some ways, we're doing design also. This slide is an attempt to offer something that is simple but useful to the field that we could use in other places. And I think Aussie in some ways has been field testing this when in talking with funders and other folks who say, well, what can games do? The test for me is, can showing them and walking people through a slide like this help explain the field in a way that they don't have to go to 2 days of conferencing? Can this give them a sense of the breadth of what games can possibly do faster? That's the goal of what this design intervention is.
Yeah, and I wonder if anyone wants to comment or if there is any question specifically on that.
You'll note that we have examples too, because that's another way we can give quick shortcuts. You may recognize a couple of the games. Of course, that's controversial. And of course, in a couple of years, we may have to change what the examples are. But that was another piece of this. Yeah.
You're saying that impact is what you make it mean.
He said impact is what you make it mean.
Yeah, I think it's your goal, right? So you're identifying what you want the game to do. I would say it's more of an active thing than about meaning, and that what that game then, what you hope that game will do is sort of established as part of your impact goal. So if you want that game to create awareness, then your impact might be, let's see how many thousands of people will actually watch this or play this or share this.
So intention. Yes.
Yeah, it would be defined by the team, right? So the team might include designers and partners and experts, and yeah.
And I would say in a real world context. So in a sense, what we're also saying here, it's not like this community or games are floating in some limbo. I mean, people are trying to effect change for decades and hundreds of years. And they're doing it with traditional ways, with digital, with social media. And this mapping is also going in a way to those other disciplines and seeing where games fit. They're obviously working differently, and sometimes better and sometimes less effectively, but they map to other disciplines in the world that are trying to change people's minds.
Yeah. In some ways, we're trying to be really pragmatic with the whole approach. So it's when, rather than defining impact with an academic theory, which is tempting, and saying, oh, this is truth, we're instead asking, well, this is impact, whether it's useful. Can you do something with this kind of impact? So if you're trying to achieve impact, these are categories where other people have tried to do similar things. And then you can look at how have they tried to measure whether or not they've been successful. So in each of these areas, there are points of comparison which I think are useful. So for instance, if you're doing community building and redevelopment, there's a whole set of examples there, and you probably don't want to just compare it with a board game. No, go compare it with an existing community redevelopment project and say, is my game intervention doing something similar, working in a similar way?
Or maybe it complements something that is done already, right?
And you can even take, design patterns you might see. So a community-based game might involve people having to find each other, right? So thinking of that as a design pattern that you might use with a completely different set of technologies or set of goals or game design, but those are certain kinds of patterns. I will say, I don't just make games for change. I make games for entertainment and for fun. Those are the kind of games I like to play a lot of too, and many of my students also do, and it's really related to these ideas. Part of what I try to get students to do when they're making a game, just to create an experience, is answer the question, how do you want the player to feel? How do you want them to feel? So what is it's kind of an aesthetic goal. Games give us kind of a feeling, right? A certain sensibility. So I think that's also as related to this idea of impact as we're talking about here, which is more in the games for change, where we measure change, as part of our success.
I think a complement to this is that often when I've heard people talk about impact, they make assumptions about how we measure it. So Folded is an interesting example. Here's a game where you're folding proteins, and as a success, there have actually been science articles written about how interesting protein formation has been discovered and published as scientific findings. So the curious thing, though, I've overheard people say, well, but the learning isn't very good in that game. And I think it's an interesting question. Is it even a learning game, right? They're actually trying to accomplish science. And if the game is successful, they publish new findings that are then used by the scientific community. So whether or not it's a good learning game may not be the question. And it can be kind of freeing to recognize games do lots of things. They entertain, and maybe that can be enough. They may also do science, and that can be enough. And of course, they often do several of these things.
So it's 425.
Yeah,
I think we got to get to failure.
I wanted to say, let's move to the gaps, and yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So Upstairs, we've also, on the second floor, we've been having people contribute. Some of you in this room may have added some of these barriers and solutions. And we would love this to be an ongoing conversation. We're going to analyze some of these later, continue to turn it into the next report. We've also identified, I'm going to skip over some of these here, some of the gaps that I think could be fun to continue building on as a community. If anyone would like to contribute to our blog or work with us on this, we'd love to have this be a broader conversation about how can we address some of these gaps. Anything people want to jump in around these, or any comments that people have at this point? Yeah. Did you want to?
I'm Jessica Clark. I work with Media Impact Funders. So all the funders who are making you decide what the impact of your games are, that's our network. I run something called Dot Connector Studio, and I've been working in this impact field for about 10 years. This conversation is one of many across the media fields. And so, of course, we made a game about it. Yeah. Our deck has emotions, outcomes, senses. I haven't written the rules yet. I was hoping that some of you might want to talk to me about how to write rules for it. So that's me.
Very cool. So it already has a game now.
Yeah, exactly.
Attached to the report.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah, I want to bring up some failed things. I think that's we don't talk about it enough, and I don't think we kind of dissect and analyze that
We're
stuff
celebrating
enough.
too much, right?
Yeah. It's like I was a cheerleader in high school, believe it or not, but no longer. Not at Games for Change.
We want to improve. We want to learn.
Be more critical. And so I will say that yesterday I talked about a couple of different cases. It's worth reading the Psychology Today article about Spent, and I think there's probably more there. Spent was a game that was meant to raise empathy about poverty, and it ended up backfiring and doing quite the opposite for a certain number of players who then, after they finished playing the game, had less empathy for those in poverty because they felt that because the game was a set of right or wrong choices, well, poor folks are just making the wrong choices. And so thinking about what games can and can't do, what kinds of design strategies you could use to take a little bit of agency away could be a way of solving that kind of problem. But here again, we're talking about is the impact that you want to see, the impact that's actually happening from the game.
Any more?
Yeah, I wanted to mention one that is kind of my
so that'd be design and intention, sorry.
Yeah, my favorite failure, the creation versus distribution, or let's call it launch, pre-launch versus post-launch. So I think that as this community and sector grows, we also need to think about it more seriously. If in the past it was enough to get your game out there, it was so tough to get the funding, and it was so complex to make a game that is both engaging and has impact. I think we need to move to the place where the commercial industry is now, that launching a game is sometimes only the beginning. And there's a lot of servicing, iteration, understanding. I mean, think about even the sequels. I mean, we like to joke and we hate sequels, but there is a reason sequels exist, because you build on top of what you already created based on enormous feedback you got from your players. And what I'm seeing in the field is that a lot of the budget and the effort goes to get the game out, and then nobody plays it. Or then we cannot change it anymore. And in the commercial industry, you might see sometimes 50-50 ratio or 60-40 between development and distribution.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to have funds, right? After you've released the game, you need to have a funding stream or model in order to continue to support it and support players.
Yeah, you did it for players, right?
Yeah.
It's very often I hear that people don't have enough money to do the evaluation and assessment, right? This comes up again and again. I see a lot of heads nodding. And I think that one key thing that's in the report that we talked a little, that's worth mentioning, is that there's a difference between designing for measurement later and actually doing the measurement. And too often, the fact that you may not have the resources to actually gather all the data and do all the analysis is used as an excuse not to think about the data analysis and just to build the game. And so as much as we think about if we doing paper prototyping to quickly iterate on a game, you might want to think about what does it mean to paper prototype the assessment, to iteratively design the assessment, not just iteratively design the game, because if you're iterating, the thing is changing, right? That's the whole point of iteration, is that you refine. So iteration on the assessment side is something that is also important. How do you let the assessment and evaluation and measurement side also be an iterative process? So these are examples of how we're trying to learn from failure, both at the level of outcome and in process, how we approach the design project. That's what this panel has been about.
I don't know if we have like one more second for a quick example. Another one, optics in the press versus intention. I'll speak from my own experience. Via PETLab and a company, Area Code, which was behind making money also, we designed a game called Budget Ball that was played every year on the National Mall between college students and congressional budget officers. This is quite the spectacle. And it was a sport, fiscal sport. And the Huffington Post covered it, and they called it Ayn Rand meets Death Race 2000. Now, that wasn't really the attention we had, but that's the optics that it had because of the funder. The funder was actually kind of a financial person. I won't mention them. And it looked a lot like some kind of crazy combat sort of death race, Ayn Randian, best budgeter wins game. That wasn't actually the way the game worked. And so you have to really be careful of like what your game looks like, how it sounds. If you're
it's communicated.
If you're interested in any press coverage or if you get any.
And maybe just one way to make this concrete is I see a lot of game projects that launch the game and don't really launch a website that talks about their intention. I would argue that, especially when we're trying to engage the public, that communicating the context sets the terms for all these evaluation questions. So publishing the context, maybe even before you publish the game, but certainly when you do publish the game, take a risk, be brave, be willing to say what you were trying to do, not just launch the thing and then let people interpret on their own. So I think publishing context is something all of us can probably do a little more. We can take more questions afterward, but I think we are technically over time. Is that right? Yeah? Any?
Darn.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This report is available for download, so thank you.
Yeah, check out the report. It's good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.